Well, it's certainly been a busy and hectic start to the Seahawks offseason with head coaching changes, coaching staff moves, player moves, and news. It's different. It's a whole different flavor this offseason, right? Well, now we get a chance to kind of take a deep breath, step back, and take a wider view as we head into the rest of the offseason. Combine coming up soon. Free agency, the draft. How's the roster going to take shape? How are they going to manage the salary cap? Is the quarterback situation as finalized as we think it is as we sit here today? Who better to bring on the show and talk about the 360-degree view of the Seahawks than the managing editor of the outstanding website fieldgulls.com, Mookie Alexander, is joining me today to talk Seahawks. What else on Seahawks Forever?
Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viennes.
Got to interact last night with some of the Seahawks brass at a charity event. Got some cool insight, most of which I won't share with you. Also got a couple of really nice bottles of bourbon. You can see one on the back there if you're watching on YouTube right there. That is the limited edition throwback Maker's Mark bottle from last year. Got a couple autographs on there as well. And then one of the guests who bought a place at the auction gave me a bottle of his specialty Maker's Mark bourbon, where John and Tracy Schneider had gone back to the distillery in Kentucky and chosen the stave combination to add to that barrel to affect the flavor. Here's the dilemma, though. Do I leave it capped forever or do I drink it? I'll make that decision when the time comes. Thank you for joining me on the show. I am Dan Viennes. You can follow me on Twitter at Seahawks Forever. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, the bell button for notification of new episodes. And if you listen on audio podcasts and that's what you prefer, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. On Spotify, you can subscribe. You can literally subscribe for a very low monthly fee. And then you get to listen to episodes that are exclusive just to you that don't have any ads in them. And if you want to support me, as a few of you did yesterday, really appreciate it. You can buy me a coffee or a beer. Those links will be in the description. Excited about this. Everything has been so hyper-focused the last, 4 to 6 weeks. I guess it is. Time flies, right? When you're having a good time. So hyper-focused on specific minutia and specific news items. Obviously, the head coaching search and then the offensive coordinator search took center stage. And then yesterday it was the Geno Smith news and the introduction of the coordinators. Got to meet Jay Harbaugh yesterday as well as some guy named Mike Macdonald, head coach of the Seahawks, who looks even younger in person, I will say. But I'll just say this. He's extremely appreciative of being here, and he's taking it all in. And it's a much different aura than Coach Carroll. Very fresh. And really looking forward to seeing what this staff can do. And the staff continues to fill out. Kennedy Palomalu hired today as running backs coach, a long time, really balancing out what we're seeing now on that coaching staff. Some young, fresh, green faces, some new to the NFL altogether. But Palomalu has been around 60 years old, 30 plus years in the NFL coaching running backs. His last 2 stops, the Las Vegas Raiders and the Minnesota Vikings, coached Dalvin Cook and Josh Jacobs. Corbin Smith tweeted out today that he's one of the best running back coaches in the business. He had gone to a coaching clinic with him before and was really impressed back when Corbin was coaching running backs, had a big impact on him. So they continue to look for a veteran presence in some of those spots. The staff not completely filled out, but is headed that way. I think 10 coaches are in place. All right, but let's get to it. My special guest today, Mookie and I go back a ways. In fact, I give him a lot of credit for where this show sits today because he allowed me to take over the Field Gulls podcast. When Brandon Schultz stepped aside a couple of years ago, Brandon recommended me. Mookie gave me the gig along with Dana O'Gorman. And I got to do that for 1 year before SB Nation decided to shutter their entire podcast division on all their websites. But it gave me the opportunity to take this platform and rebrand it into my own podcast. And here we are today. growing at a record pace. Thank you to all who have subscribed and listened and watched and continue to as we head forward. So much to talk about over the next couple of months. We're going to touch on a lot of those topics today. Let's get into my conversation with Mookie. Welcome back to the show, Mookie Alexander. It has been a minute, as we were just discussing, the managing editor of Field Gulls, my longtime favorite Seahawks website. How are you, man?
I'm doing all right, Dan. In fact, the last time I was on your podcast, it was the final playoff game of the Pete Carroll era. And now we're hoping for the first playoff game of the Mike Macdonald era pretty soon.
Indeed. And we're going to get into that. We're going to get into some stuff. I'm looking forward to talking to you, as I always would be, but because this offseason, ever since the news broke, since Pete was removed from his post, it's been very specialized. It was the head coaching search, and then it was the offensive coordinator search. We get to kind of take a deep breath now and look at the big picture a little bit. And it's one of the things I want to explore with you today. First of all, let me ask you this, because I know what it's been like for me in comparison to other off seasons in which I've done this. 14 years of the same kind of messaging, the same thing in the offseason. Now it's all new. What's the traffic been like on your website?
The traffic has been I-5 rush hour times 50 as a result of all of the head coaching searches, the speculation about the roster. I mean, of course, this was expected because you end up with Pete Carroll leaving, and we didn't totally expect it at the time. But I think there was the clear hints when Ian Rappaport said that Seahawks management was going to meet with Carroll at the end of the season. I think that was a hint there, because at the time, I think most of us were going, including me, Pete's not getting fired. He's got 2 more years left on his contract. They're going to let him see out at least next season. And then we find out that second year of his contract is not guaranteed. They go, oh, if they want to let him go, then it's only 1 year's salary that they got to pay. So that kind of lessened the blow as far as him being let go. But it's still, watching it happen, it just takes you off guard. And then watching the emotional press conference afterward, like, wow, this is somebody who's been the coach of my favorite football team for half my life, and now we're entering this great new unknown. But I think maybe for the sake of this fan base that's finding something different that could be better, it could be worse, absolutely. That you could say that for everything, but something that could be even better, return to the level of greatness that we had under Pete Carroll several years back. I mean, the allure of the new and the allure of the unknown is what drives fan bases, and it provides a level of optimism that probably would not have been there if Carroll had gotten another year. Because especially with the defensive side of the ball, there wasn't a lot to think, wow, this team is just so close to having a good defense again when the results were getting exceedingly worse. So now you hire a head coach who ended up turning a bad Ravens defense, and you don't say that very often, and back to being one of the best. Again, no guarantee that it's going to happen. It's not going to necessarily be an overnight fix, but based on what we have seen with his work in Baltimore and even his 1 year at the University of Michigan, there's a lot to like about Mike Macdonald and the way he carries himself. And I know actions speak louder than words, but I'm impressed by his words.
Yeah, and his demeanor and other people's words too. You cannot find anyone who has a negative thing to say about this guy. And not just that, it's the way people rave about him and his mind and the way he thinks and the way he communicates. I was really intrigued yesterday listening to Schneider's radio spot with Bob Shelton and Dave Wyman. And they asked him, when did Mike Macdonald get, come on your radar? And he said it was the year that he went to Michigan. That was when he first kind of his ears perked up, and he said, who's this guy that's, going from linebackers coach with the Ravens, going to work for Jim Harbaugh? It's a fascinating dynamic. I'm glad you touched on it, because I've been telling people this for years in regards to the quarterback situation, in regards to the head coaching situation. There's been a segment of the fan base, I'm sure they're very vocal on your website, that have wanted Pete out for years. Mm-hmm. And to which I would usually say, be careful what you wish for, because look how many of these hot shot, can't miss, up and coming, hot name coaches get hired over the last 3-4 years who are now out of work, or at least out of the head coaching business. But now that it's reality and it's taken a while to sink in, well, you're forced to confront, the opportunity for change. And it can be very exciting because it's different. And that's why people are so hungry for information, and why I knew that was going to be your answer with the website, because I've seen it here as well. What now to this point, the coaching staff isn't fully filled out, and you guys have a great tracker on your website. I think it was just updated today with the hire of Kennedy Polamalu as running backs coach, longtime veteran, outstanding running backs coach, who most recently has coached Josh Jacobs and Dalvin Cook. with the Vikings and the Raiders. Your overall impressions of how they're constructing the staff so far?
So far, so good. I am intrigued by the number of assistants that they have hired who come from primarily college backgrounds.
Mhm.
Because Jay Harbaugh, a good chunk of his time has been with his dad at Michigan, and I think he did some grad assistant stuff elsewhere. Now he has NFL experience. He was with Mike Macdonald in Baltimore for a brief period of time. But then you also have Ryan Grubb, who has 0 days of NFL
Yeah.
experience, and now he's the offensive coordinator. They just hired wide receivers coach Frisman Jackson, I believe, and he again comes from primarily a college background. They're looking at they haven't hired a quarterbacks coach yet, but
Yep.
the person that they've just interviewed again primarily worked at college level. So again, that's the part where things feel different when you have new faces and new ideas, and not necessarily people with tons of NFL experience on the coaching staff. But you do have those mix of veterans. So having Leslie Frazier on the staff as an assistant head coach, somebody with head coaching experience who on the defensive side of the ball has produced really good results in Buffalo. It's just that unfortunately he was in a conference with Patrick Mahomes, and he just breaks defenses. So you have him as an experienced assistant head coach, and then you have the hiring of Kennedy Polamalu as a well-respected veteran running backs coach. So,
Yeah.
and then now you have Adden Dirty. Now that I found out that his first name rhymes with Madden, first time defensive coordinator. But you have the Dan Quinn connection is there, and based on what we've seen in Dallas, and I know they got ripped apart in the playoffs, but their defensive line has been pretty good for as long as he's been the D line coach. And Macdonald and Dirty didn't have any sort of known prior relationship. In fact, I think Macdonald or Dirty might have said it, but their vision seems to be aligned as far as how they view football and how they view defense. So it looks like a cohesive staff. It should be. What I'm hoping for this year's team, regardless of the wins and losses, is that this looks like a well-coached team. Because my biggest criticism of last year's team is that we know that Pete Carroll is a very good coach and that he has hired some really good assistants over the years. That was one of the worst coached or worst looking coach teams I'd seen in a long time under Pete Carroll. So if there's some level of competence where we know that the problem is really that there's a talent deficit more as opposed to just being poorly coached, I think we can work with that as longer term optimism with Macdonald and the rest of the staff.
It was interesting. John addressed that yesterday as well, and likened it to the draft process, and because this is really one of the concerning things about waiting so long to get your guy, in waiting to get Macdonald until he was available, and they were prepared to wait even longer if they had gone to the Super Bowl, is a lot of these guys get hired, and all the other spots that have been filled by new head coaches, 6 of the 8 anyway, before Macdonald was hired, those guys have a head start hiring some of these in-demand assistants. And John likened it to the draft in that he had a board, and he said as soon as Macdonald came to town, and the morning he was hired, even before the press conference the next day, he said as soon as all that was done and he accepted the offer, they went into Schneider's office, spent 2.5 hours on a whiteboard, basically going over coaching candidates. And Mike had his ideas, and John had guys he had already been talking to, because this isn't an old school situation where you hire a coach and here he goes, he brings all his staff with him. In fact, remarkably, I think not a single coach has come over from the Baltimore Ravens staff, and that's really unusual. It's as if they're treating it like the draft, just trying to find the best guys available and then putting them all in a room together and hoping they can figure out how to work together.
Yeah, that is a very good point, because think of how many Ravens assistants have already left, but to other teams. The Dolphins had Anthony Weaver as their defensive coordinator. I think Denard Wilson is Tennessee's defensive coordinator, or he's there in some other role. So they have lost a lot of people over this offseason, and yet none of them came to Seattle. Whereas the closest we have seen to bringing somebody over who's worked with that person at another level is of course Ryan Grubb getting to bring Scott Huff over
Right.
as the offensive line coach. And I think that is really important, because one thing that we've seen with Ryan Grubb and at the University of Washington is that offensive line is super impressive. And Huff even precedes Grubb there on the coaching staff.
Yeah.
He was
7
retained
years.
when Kalen DeBoer got hired. So other than that, we're seeing just like the head coaching search, we're seeing a wide net being cast. And that includes the offensive coordinator search. I'm sure that they've interviewed other people for position coaches, position spots, and also that defensive coordinator, special teams coordinator. hasn't been publicized, but you can tell that they're not just zeroed in, other than Macdonald. I think that was their primary, but they're not zeroed in on just got to have this person, got to have that person. It's we're open to everything, so that we have a wide range of ideas and a general guidelines as to who fits our criteria.
Let's talk about Ryan Grubb some more, because obviously that was the biggest concern. When you hire a defensive head coach, now you got to find a guy to run the offense and do it effectively and make it dynamic and use all those weapons we have, get the most out of the quarterback situation, which we will talk about in a minute. But also, the concern that by hiring a defensive coach, that if you hire a good coordinator, that, a couple years down the road, he's going to be in demand and get a head coaching gig. Grubb, you mentioned it, never coached a day in the NFL. From everything you've seen in how he operates an offense and everything you've heard about him, how much are you concerned about that?
My concern would be adapting the chunk of his scheme that relies on the college hash marks over to the pros, because that is a huge barrier. In as far as on the defensive side of the ball, it's just harder to disguise coverages in college compared to the NFL, when the hash marks are 40 yards wide in college and they're like 18 yards wide at the NFL. So the field is more condensed. And I am a little bit concerned about that from Grubb's side, but I trust that he can adapt. And I really like that he has been an offensive line coach. He's been a run game coordinator. And then as offensive coordinator, he has developed 2 really high-level passing offenses, both at Washington and with Jake Haener over at Fresno State.
Yeah.
So he values explosive plays, which I think is not just exclusively a Pete Carroll philosophy. I think John Schneider is absolutely a fan of explosive plays and attacking teams deep down the field. Mm-hmm. But we know that Grubb also values the run game. He might have had a high pass rate and a high rate of deep passing with Washington, but we also saw that there were times when the Huskies' passing game wasn't necessarily clicking, so they just pounded the running game with Dylan Johnson. And he has a physical offensive line, and I think that's what Seattle is hoping for, is that if they can get a more consistent and more consistently reliable running game going, that is really going to change and open up the playbook as far as their willingness to attack down the field. Because I felt like last year, and even in some parts of the Waldron era in 2021 and 2022, when the running game sort of stalled out, they basically didn't really have much of an identity. And I know it sounds cliche, but they just couldn't figure out who they actually were. Are we a power running team? Are we a team that wants to sling it down the field? Are we a quick passing team? What are we? I think Grubb is going to have some growing pains being a first-time NFL offense coordinator and play caller, but his philosophies, I think, can translate to the pro game, especially the play action stuff. And you don't need a great running game to have a great play action passing game. But we know that Geno Smith, and we're assuming for now that Geno is going to be the quarterback in September. But even if he isn't, whichever quarterback is starting for Seattle, I think that basing things off of play action is going to be of paramount importance to this offense, because when you look at the receiving core and you got DK and Lockett and Smith and Jigba, and you could add more to the roster over free agency and the draft, those are high efficiency play action targets you're looking at. And I think Grubb is going to be really excited to see what he can do with the weapons that he has at his disposal in Seattle. Because the concern, of course, when you go from college to the NFL is, oh yeah, but you have NFL caliber receivers and talent at a collegiate level. Well, guess what? He's got NFL caliber receivers in the NFL.
Yeah, and he was really excited about those guys. He talked about it yesterday. He mentioned play action. Geno's numbers on play action passes last year, I think, were top 5 in the league. He's been shown to be outstanding in those situations, even without a consistent running game there. I like what he said about that his scheme is personnel based, because that was honestly my biggest complaint about Waldron. I thought at times he showed talent as a play designer or play caller, but it just didn't feel like he got the most out of his talent. And the good offensive coordinators do. Every game, they find a way to involve their guys on a consistent basis. And he mentioned it yesterday. He said, look, the reason we were so wide open at UW is because we had those receivers. I mean, we had Dylan Johnson, and there were times, as you said, we leaned on that USC game where he went for over 300 yards, 4 touchdowns, and because it just wasn't working. But he had those receivers. Is Geno going to be the guy throwing it to him if you had to put a percentage on it today? And I know everybody wants to talk about how he could still be traded by March 18th, and that could happen. I talked on the show this week about potential fits, and there are some teams that have the resources and might have a need for a guy like Geno. But if you had to put a percentage on it, him starting opening day this year, what would you think it would be?
I put it at around 80 to 20. So 80% that he will be the starter. If there is a good deal, something that involves a second-round pick. He's not going for 2 first-round picks, as I joked about the other day. He's not going to the Denver Broncos for 2 more firsts. I'm pretty sure that Denver will hang up the phone anytime John Schneider comes calling. But if there's a deal that's too good to pass up, then I think they will just trade Geno away, which I wouldn't want to do just sentimentally, because I think he's been a great story and that he was better than his stats showed last season. It's just that there were a lot of circumstances beyond his control that impacted his numbers. And also there were some struggles that he genuinely had, but I think he overcame them as the season progressed, particularly after he came back from injury. But I would think that he would be the QB1. That doesn't mean that Seattle doesn't draft a quarterback, and nor that they shouldn't draft a quarterback. Right. They absolutely should take a quarterback, because where I will push back with some of my good colleagues on Seahawks Twitter, Geno is 34 without a lot of tread on his tires because he hasn't played a ton of games. But 34 is also still 34. And the number of quarterbacks who are still effective at 37, 38 years old, whether they've got a lot of mileage or not, is still very, very small. So I do think that Schneider will be looking at the quarterback market in the draft. And to me, I look at Schneider's background in Green Bay and how they let Rodgers sit behind Favre, and they've let Jordan Love sit behind Rodgers, and so far so good. With of course, it worked out pretty well with Rodgers. They got a Super Bowl out of it, and Jordan Love just tore it up. He looked like a completely different quarterback the second half of the season. And we think about the hypotheticals of him looking at Mahomes and Josh Allen, and he straight up said that they had considered taking Andy Dalton back in 2011. None of them would have been a day one starter. For 2011, they had Tavares Jackson. I think they had signed him by then. And even if they didn't, I don't think that Schneider had even explicitly said Dalton would just be a day one starter in Seattle. And then Russell Wilson was still on the team when they were looking at Mahomes and Allen. And we certainly know all the
in his prime.
Yes, all the backstory there. So if they draft a quarterback, I believe that if it's somebody that they truly believe can be a starter, they will sit behind Geno for at least a season. But the one wild card here is what they do with Drew Lock.
Yeah, they keep talking about.
I would be really surprised if Lock is QB1 in September. I'd be really surprised at that. And that would, to me, reinforce the idea that Schneider really is high on Drew Lock. And he said that they had considered drafting him a couple of years ago. I think that was from the press conference after they had traded Russ away. Yeah. But I suppose there's nothing stopping them from keeping Geno and Lock and drafting a quarterback within the first.
Sure, talk like they're going to. Yeah, it's odd.
Yeah, and what you would do is that Lock's the one whose roster spot wouldn't be guaranteed come preseason. If it's Geno, Lock, and a rookie quarterback, and Lock is on a pretty cheap deal where it doesn't cost a lot to cut him, or you could trade him, you could have that rookie quarterback be in competition with Lock. Heck, he could be in competition with both of them, with both Geno and Lock, depending on how things go. So I think that they will keep Geno unless there's a deal that is too good to pass up. But they're always in on everything, and they're always looking at, hey, if there's an offer that's a team is coming that is proposed to us, we'll consider it, and then we'll make a decision from there. And they'll do it with just about any player. So Geno is no different, especially with the lack of a second round pick, which is unfortunately Schneider and Carroll's own doing with the Leonard Williams trade.
Yeah. And when it comes to Geno, that's why today wasn't really the deadline. And it wasn't, in my opinion. It's March 18th. It's the beginning of the new league year. It's the combine's coming up in 2 weeks. That's when a lot of these discussions are begun or had. Late at night in back rooms of restaurants and bars and hotels and things like that. And a lot of these deals are ultimately put together. So we're going to have to deal with this discussion for another month. If Geno's still on the roster March 18th, then he's probably the guy moving forward. What is it? I can't, Corbin Smith and I were joking about this the other day. We can't, post a story or do a podcast about the Seahawks linebacker core without someone jumping in and saying, yeah, but what about Geno? He sucks. They need to get rid of him or none of this is going to work. I'm sure you get that too in your message boards and everything else on the website. Where do you think that comes from? Why is it that so much of the fan base is absolutely anti Geno Smith?
I think Bill Parcells had a quote about that I'm probably going to butcher, but the general idea is you don't always have to look at somebody and how they used to be and just ascribe that to them forever. And I think because of his struggles and just outright bad play with the Jets, and that he just out of nowhere is suddenly a starting caliber quarterback, people cannot get themselves past, well, this is how he looked at the Jets. This is how he ended up not being a starting quarterback for so many years until he came to Seattle. And also, it's a tough act to succeed Russell Wilson. I know there's some significant animosity towards Russ now, and especially some enjoyment watching how the Denver thing has panned out, but he's still the best quarterback in franchise history. He's one of the best athletes in the history of Seattle sports. So whoever was going to succeed Russell Wilson was always going to be put under a significant microscope. And I think we tend to look at Geno too much through the prism of Wilson, or at least the best years of Wilson. And nobody should ever say that Geno is better than Wilson has ever been, because that's silly. Wilson is a borderline Hall of Fame caliber player at his absolute best years, and Geno isn't quite at that level. But Geno, he just divides opinion so much, and I think part of it is because of Locke also being on the roster, and that Locke is the younger player. He's got the big arm, but does he process the game the same way as Geno? Is he accurate with his big arm? Because that is my big sticking point with the whole, well, Locke's arm talent is amazing. Yes, he can throw the ball probably 70 yards down the field, and I think his arm strength is better than Geno's. But over the years, he's been a very inaccurate deep passer, which makes that Eagles drive all the more incredible. But still, there are reasons that Geno was a starter over Locke, and also the idea that Locke can use his legs more. He hardly ran in college. He hardly runs in the pros. Right. Geno is a more traditional pocket passer. He's not super mobile, but we can see him scramble. So the divisiveness of the fan base is sort of disappointing, but that is probably part of the natural come down from we had 10 years of uninterrupted great quarterback play to now we're going another tier below, and a tier below might as well feel like not a good quarterback whatsoever. And that's, to me, unfair to Geno. I won't paint Geno as somebody who is going to be like a guaranteed MVP candidate or anything like that, but it can absolutely be somebody that you can win playoff games with. And I mean, we just had Jared Goff almost make the Super Bowl for a second time, and that dude gets ragged on all the time. So the success of Patrick Mahomes and other similarly top level quarterbacks has sort of warped our viewpoints as far as the quarterback position. Like, oh, if you don't have Mahomes, then you have no chance. No, that's not necessarily true. If you have a really good quarterback, which I think Geno is, but you also have the great pieces around him, right, then you can compete with absolutely anybody. And we should know that because Matt Hasselbeck in 2005, really good quarterback. He had the MVP running back. He had the best offensive line in the league. He had a pretty good defense, and they made the Super Bowl. So maybe it's a little bit harder for teams to do that now, especially with the way that the rule changes and everything kind of gravitate towards having the haves and have-nots at quarterback, but it's also not impossible. I'd rather we not have everybody trying to chase the exact same thing, the exact same model of team building, because many teams are just going to end up completely falling flat on their face, chasing something that's really, really hard to attain.
I hope anyone watching this who doesn't like Geno Smith listens to what you just said, because as you're talking about it, I'm thinking about this stuff in my head too. And you named all the names I was thinking about. Russell, during his 10-year run here, was an elite quarterback, one of the top quarterbacks in the league, but every single week would do things that would drive us crazy, make horrible mistakes, miss guys that are open, make terrible decisions. But fans were willing to give him a pass because of the big picture and because of what he did, kind of his whole, everything that he did on a weekly basis. With Geno, he makes one or two mistakes, and that's all they can focus on. Hasselbeck, another great example. His career didn't start out great here at all. He got benched for Trent Dilfer, had to kind of come back from that. And yet, by the end of his career, he was pretty much beloved by most of the fan base. You touched on Jared Goff. He was viewed certainly by the Rams as a bust, basically, as the first pick overall in the draft, and a throw in and kind of a creative trade and just a way to shed some salary. He goes to Detroit and completely changes his profile, and people seem to have come around to that now and accepted Jared Goff as one of the better quarterbacks in the league. I don't know what the sticking point is. I've had people literally tell me in the last couple of days, multiple people, want to make a laundry list of all the bad games Geno had last year that they want to use as an example of how bad he is. And many of them mentioned the Pittsburgh game. I'm like, what were you watching? He was one of the only reasons we had a chance to win that game. He did some of his best work avoiding the rush, moving around the pocket, making big time throws down the field. I don't get it, but whether or not he is the quarterback coming up this fall, the direction of the rest of the roster, right? And we're not going to get into that position group by position group. There's certainly not enough time for that. But as the draft approaches, they don't have the second round pick. You mentioned that. There's a lot of talk about quarterback or not quarterback at 16 or somewhere else in the first round. And if you do that, then you have to wait till the third to address the rest of your roster. If you're the GM of the team today, from what you know today about anything you may have looked at heading into the draft or just positional needs that you value, what would you like to see him do with that first pick in the draft?
It sounds cliche, but please keep addressing the trenches. And that offensive line, defensive line, it doesn't matter. Offensive line is going to be very interesting because of Abe Lucas, actually. Because I know that's
we don't know.
Lewis is a free agent at left guard. And then if Phil Haynes goes, then whatever. Anthony Bradford probably would start, and I would still just draft another guard for depth's sake. And then even at center, Evan Brown, do you re-sign him or do you let Oluwatimi become the starter? But Abe Lucas, I think, is the X factor because I believe he had another procedure or something like that, or at least that was suggested on his social media.
It's a mystery. Yeah.
But the mystery concerning his knee and the fact that he came back and then suddenly he ended up he just couldn't go towards the end of the Pittsburgh game and he misses the last game of the season. So you hope that it's not some sort of degenerative condition where it's only a matter of time before he's either a shell of himself or he just medically can't play anymore. They might have to look at tackle yet again. And that would be a real disappointment because it looked like we had two cornerstone tackles and one of them was a third round pick. But I just look at the last four teams in this year's postseason. And funnily enough, it's the 49ers offensive line that looked the worst. Yeah. But they also have a future Hall of Famer in Trent Williams. But Baltimore's offensive line, very impressive. We know Kansas City and Creed Humphrey, who Seattle could have absolutely drafted. But you still had Trey Smith at right guard and of course, they made the big splash signing for Joe Thuney. Jawan Taylor, probably still a miracle that he didn't get penalized at all in the Super Bowl, but still, that they haven't made every great move there. But the players that they have drafted and not signed, they've been pretty successful. And then Detroit, we already know you got Decker and Ragnow and Penei Sewell and Jonah Jackson, high-quality offensive line. So I think that they're going to have to keep investing there. And they've invested over the years. They just invested poorly.
Right.
No bad investment or investments can be good or bad. And we've seen the Luke Jokels and Jamarcus Webbs, some of the just rotten free agent signings that they've made over the years. And then just some bad draft picks like Riso Diambo for starters. And then Jermaine Ifedi, not as bad as made out to be, but also really not good enough to be a long-term starter. So that's just on the offensive side of the ball. On the defensive line, they could use another pass rusher. And I think the depth got exposed big time when Nwosu went down because suddenly it went to Boye Maffe's shoulders, and Mafe could only do so much before teams just started double teaming him and game planning him straight out of the game. And when the opposite rusher outside of Mafe is Darrell Taylor, who I don't think that they should resign. They shouldn't tender him at all. Yeah. And then you get to the limited Frank Clark experience, the unwanted reunion. They just didn't have a lot there, and that includes Derek Hall. So if they look for another edge rusher, I think that would be really, really beneficial because one thing that we've seen in Baltimore with Macdonald is they have so much pass rushing depth. And it wasn't necessarily with absolutely top line, high price draft picks. It's guys who have been around the league for a while. Kyle Van Noy was on the practice squad. Yeah. And then suddenly had one of the best seasons of his career. Jadeveon Clowney almost got double-digit sacks for the first time ever. And who knows if he'll just reunite.
And he's a free agent.
Seattle. He is a free agent. And this is the healthiest we've ever seen him as well.
Right.
And then you've got Matabike on the interior. Brent Urban as an interior run stuffer as well. So I think they're going to look at the trenches with pick 16 specifically, because I think we know that's the big question mark on this roster in terms of absolute need because of lack of depth at the position has got to be inside linebacker, off-ball linebacker, because both of your starters are free agents, and one of them is just not what he used to be. So we don't want to go into the offseason figuring out. Mike Macdonald has went from Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen to question mark, and question mark.
Right.
But Patrick Queen is a free agent. So that also is worth thinking about for a bit.
Yeah, that's going to be fascinating. I talked about it recently, but for fans who don't remember, Patrick Queen was drafted one pick behind Jordan Brooks, and it came out after the draft because Brooks was seen by many as a reach at that point, just because he was kind of an unknown name. He wasn't really viewed as a consensus first rounder. And then it came out later that the Ravens favored Brooks too, had him higher on their board, would have taken him if he was there with that pick, and settled for Patrick Queen. So would be interesting to know now, if given the choice between the two, who Mike Macdonald might prefer. I'm with you. I certainly, inside linebacker is not something you're going to take in the first round. The positional value just isn't there. But this year's draft, from what I've seen so far, is much, much deeper at that position than last year. Last year, the linebacker group was a lot of guys that were 215 to 220, more weak side linebacker guys, nickel robber types, but a lot more in that more traditional mold of the bigger, more physical inside linebackers that can shed blocks 6'2", 230, 235, 240 that they can dip into. If I'm drafting today, I would just remind people that Seahawks pick 16th, as it were, right now. Steve Hutchinson was drafted with the 17th pick. And to me, I'm taking, if the right defensive tackle there is there, certainly a guy like Jerzon Newton or maybe even a Byron Murphy. But I'm with you. They got to fix that offensive line. And it all kind of ties back into the QB discussion that, for those that don't think that Geno was consistent enough or good enough, I'd sure like to see what he does with more drives, more plays, because the defense can get off the field and with a better running game. So I'm going offensive line, but I reserve the right to change my mind a lot over the next 2 months, as I often do. Mookie, man, it's been great to catch up with you again. What do you got going on the website coming up?
Well, we got the NFL Combine coverage to do over the next couple of weeks. The Underwear Olympics are back, ladies and gentlemen, in Indianapolis. And
I can't get enough of them, though. I got to watch every minute of them.
Of course, we reserve the right to change our minds, because people are going to have their stock rise. They're going to have their stock fall. And there are only a handful of players we know are going to be slam dunk first round picks, whether they even do the combine or not. But there are others who could go from the first round to the third round, or from the fourth round grade up to the first or second round. And especially not just what they do with the combine, but also medicals.
Yeah.
What do you do? Is Michael Penix Jr. going to be a Seahawk just because Ryan Grubb is the offensive coordinator?
Nope.
I mean, that'd be the worst giveaway in the history of drafting. That, we're not even hiding stuff anymore. The Pete Carroll draft clues really are a thing of the past. The John Schneider draft clues are, here's what we're doing. But if his medicals come out as concerning, then you don't know if he's going to be even a second round pick, and he could come down to Seattle as a third rounder. We'll find out all that pretty soon. But we're going to be doing quite a bit on free agency previews, draft previews, all that good stuff, because most of the coaching staff is pretty much figured out at this point. We only got a few more positional coaches and the strength and conditioning to deal with. But free agency going to be absolutely huge to see what they do with Brooks and Lewis and Noah Fant and a couple of others who have been starters or have significant snaps. And then, of course, we'll be looking at roster cuts, whether Quandre Diggs is a potential cap casualty, what they do with Jamal Adams. We assume that Brian Monet is not going to be on the team anymore, but a lot of salary cap stuff so that people can calm down a bit about the cap situation, because what the number is now is not what the Seahawks are going to be dealing with in a couple months. There will be ways to restructure. There will be ways to fiddle around and open up more space for this season and with seasons to come with the decisions they make. They are not in cap hell, so hopefully people can calm down over that and also stop freaking about Geno Smith earning potentially $20-some-odd million against the cap. That is not top 10 quarterback money. So he's not making Daniel Jones money, and he's not Daniel Jones bad.
I think I saw a tweet yesterday from, I think it might have been ESPN Analytics, that Geno's average annual value is 16th among quarterbacks, and his QBR last year was 16. So they nailed it on the value with that one, right?
I We know he can be better than 16th. And if the offensive line can be a better blocking unit than 28th or 29th, then we're really cooking with something here. But it feels like we've also been saying that about the offensive line ever since Steve Hutchinson left. So this is the Hutchinson curse as far as I am concerned.
Right. You might be right.
Contract curse.
It's fieldgulls.com. See what they did there. GULLS.com. Mookie Alexander, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Probably could have talked twice as long about a lot of other things. But instead, we'll be doing that over the next month or so. Coming up on the show, Maddie Brown of the Seattle Overload podcast has agreed to come on with me on Monday. Can't wait to get his thoughts on everything that's been going on here in Seattle. Always love his X and O expertise on both sides of the ball. We talked to Griffin Sturgeon, his co-host, recently, mostly about defense. I'm going to really pick Maddie's brain about Ryan Grubb and his offense and how he thinks it's going to translate to the league. So that'll be coming up as well. And I'll unveil a new mock draft next week as well. I'm working on a non-QB mock draft so that nobody will be mad, but also just to take a look at the possibility that they might just be trying to stock this roster as much as possible for one more offseason, roll with the QBs they have, and address that position again next year. So we'll take a look at that. Follow me on Twitter at Seahawks Forever. Thank you again for all of your support. Until next time, forever and always, go Hawks.